Hey everyone, Jack Allen Willard here. Welcome to a very special video, Dark Shadows Forever. Still huge, 55 years later. How many shows can say that? Just the Facebook groups alone, the Dark Shadows Appreciation Society, huge amount of members. Original Dark Shadows, the Old House, the David Hennessy groups, the Grayson Hall groups. There's so many Dark Shadows groups because there's still so many Dark Shadows fans. This show, which premiered in March of 1966 when I was 10 years old, has a staying power that I think would even go past Star Trek and shows like that. It is still widely watched in America and in other countries, sometimes over and over. There's 1,245 episodes, and fans watch them over and over. They go through the series, then they start again. It's a phenomenon still. It's a phenomenon that I missed, really, when I was a little kid. I didn't rush home to watch Dark Shadows like a lot of people my age did. I watched it a few times and was intrigued by it, but I never let it go beyond that. I never really got into it. Whereas the lady in my life, she and her friend that is a Hollywood actor to this day, they would come home and they would emulate what they were seeing. They would watch the show and get all excited about it and have seances and stuff. It was all very innocent. The people who watched Dark Shadows didn't go on to participate in the occult, most of them in real life in later years. It was all kind of tongue-in-cheek with an incredible cast of characters. So if you're a Dark Shadows fan, this video, it's a tribute video that you will relate to. I have images to show. We have topics to talk about. We're going to do it as fast as we can. Pause it. Subscribe, please, if you like the video. There are plenty of other great videos here as well at the Virtual Church of the Disillusioned. We speak on a variety of topics. So, the beginning story of Dark Shadows, the beginning episodes, which premiered in March of 66, starred former movie star Joan Bennett. She was in movies. She did a few silent films. She did. And then did a series of talkies, very popular movies for the time, with working with some really big co-stars in the 40s and 50s, and then it all stopped, and she was blacklisted. What would be considered today a minor incident was blown up out of proportion. Her reputation was sullied, and so Dark Shadows in 1966 was her attempt at a comeback, and it would end up being very successful. Now, when Dark Shadows went on the air in 1966, and if you're a hardcore fan, you know this, it didn't exactly catch fire. It was on at like 3:30 in the afternoon on ABC TV, and yes, Joan Bennett was there, and Alexandra Mulkey as Victoria Winters. She's the first person we see. Now, the creator of Dark Shadows is the incredible late, great Dan Curtis, who would go on to do other pictures and series, mini-series like War and Remembrance. He did that, and would revive Dark Shadows in 1991 for, I think it was NBC. But he had some great hits like Burnt Offerings that starred Betty Davis movies. But the thing that he finally realized after doing War and Remembrance, which taped for a long time, big budget miniseries, the thing he realized late in his life was the thing that would last forever was Dark Shadows. And you really have to start watching the show to know what I'm talking about. You really have to watch to get it. It's more than just a television show. There's a reason people that watch back then watch now and watch maybe 3, 4 episodes a night in some cases. We do that sometimes. We do that, my lady and I. We watch 3 or 4 episodes. We're on our third time watching the series, and it's like a family event. It's like, I guess you literally wish you were in Collinsport, Maine, the fictitious town that Dark Shadows was set in. There's something that really hooks you, especially starting with episode 210. Now, what's called the beginning episodes, which I'm told is not on Prime Video anymore, but it's on Tubi and Pluto, and you, of course, can buy it. But Tubi, Pluto would be a good way to get it. I would recommend that you start with how we did. During the pandemic, we really got into Dark Shadows in 2020, and we started with episode 210, which is the first episode that Jonathan Frid appears in as the vampire Barnabas Collins. I would start there, watch all the way through to the last episode, which occurred in the spring of 1971, episode 1245. Watch all the way through and then watch the beginning episodes, and you'll appreciate them that much more. You'll appreciate them that much more. But although Joan Bennett was signed up and the beginning episodes were good, the ratings weren't. The ratings weren't. They were in serious trouble, and Dan Curtis knew it, and he begged ABC TV for 13 more weeks. 13 more weeks. And he said, and you got to allow me to blow the doors off. And they weren't sure what that meant on daytime TV. He wanted to do it as a nighttime show originally, but they wanted it as a daytime show, and he finally agreed to do it that way. But the ratings were bad. They weren't that good. They had a little bump when they did the story of the Phoenix, starring Diana Malay. She plays the fictitious character of the Phoenix who dies in the fire but is reborn. And the show got a bump in the ratings, but it wasn't enough. They needed something more. And Dan sat around the dinner table with his kids and his wife, and one of his daughters said, "Daddy, why don't you make it scarier? Why don't you make it scarier?" And he thought, yeah. And he was talking to his writers, and he said to one of them, he said, what about a vampire? What about a vampire? He said, one of the writers said, yes, that's it. That's it. Now, they wanted him to do something like the opposite of Bela Lugosi, Dracula. They want him to do a blonde vampire that didn't look like a vampire. They wanted him to they thought that would be intriguing, to have a vampire that looked like an everyday surfer dude, but he was not. He was much more than that. But it didn't happen that way. They started, Dan Curtis had to leave the country for a while, and they started sending him pictures of various candidates. And Ron Sproat, who was one of the gifted writers of Dark Shadows, had seen this Canadian actor on stage in New York named Jonathan Frid. And he fell in love with him, and he said, that guy's got to be on Dark Shadows. I think that's who we're looking for. And he sent pictures to Dan Curtis, and Dan asked Ron Sproat, well, can he act? Can he really act? He said, he's great. He's fantastic. And Dan just made an impulse decision, looking at the picture, said, hire him. Hire him. And that would lead to the most iconic role in a daytime, you can't really call it a daytime soap. They didn't feel like it was. It was a drama. It was like a play, really, that they were doing live to tape every day. And the moment that Jonathan Frid appeared as Barnabas Collins, the ratings started going up and up and up. It was phenomenal what happened, and I'll tell you more about that. But in episode 210, we are introduced to Barnabas Collins, who has been chained in his coffin since about 1795, and now has been released by Willie Loomis. And he resurfaces at Collinwood. Just caught on like wildfire. Here he is standing in front of his portrait. He says he's the ancestor of the original Barnabas Collins, but of course it's really the same guy. There's the picture of Barnabas Collins from 1795, and there's the current Barnabas Collins. But as I say, it's really the same guy. You see Barnabas behind me, standing on the staircase of Collinwood. You can't see the ABC logo so much, the ABC logo, but it's there. You can get lots of Dark Shadows merchandise. The Blue Whale Tavern in Collinsport, Maine. Stop in for a quick bite. That's behind me. These are both the t-shirts of my lady Karen. She wears them and enjoys them. I don't wear Dark Shadows paraphernalia, but I'm a huge fan of the show. As I say, right from the beginning in 1966, we see Alexandra Mulkey as Victoria Winters. What happened before Dark Shadows came into existence is Dan Curtis had a dream about a girl going to this little town in Maine on a train, and she's going to find and discover a whole new world, a mansion on the hill. And he had this dream, and he woke up, and he told his wife all about it. And he said, but I guess it's just a dumb idea. She said, no, Danny, I love it. I love it. And he began to create Dark Shadows, which would become the most successful daytime serial of all times. People aren't watching As the World Turns every night in 2022. But all around the world, they are still watching the original Dark Shadows, starring Joan Bennett and the wonderful, incredible Jonathan Frid, with so many fantastic actors backing them up. Alexandra Mulkey had never worked. She came from a rich family from Sweden, but man, she caught on quick. She went in for the audition, and Joan Bennett happened to walk in as they were doing, I don't know if it was the first edition with Alexandra, but she came in, and as she saw her from afar, she thought, is that my daughter over there? Is that my daughter? Looks like her daughter. And of course she fell in love with her, and Joan Bennett wanting Alexandra, even though she had no experience at all, to be Victoria Winters, carried a lot of weight, and they knew how special she was. She would only be on the show until late 1968 when she got pregnant, had a kind of a rough pregnancy. She left the show, but she made her mark in the time she was there. Someone who would join the cast in 1967, a few months into the year 1967, was Grayson Hall as Dr. Julia Hoffman. She had been in the 1946 movie, I want to say, Night of the Iguana. She won a Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. I think Richard Burton was in that movie, right? So Grayson Hall came in as Dr. Julia Hoffman. Later on, she would play a gypsy known as Magda when they went back in time. And she was really good as Magda, but she played an important role on Dark Shadows. She has a lot of fans, a lot of Dark Shadows fans love her. Now, they had a character fairly early on, once Barnabas was on board after episode 210, known as Willie Loomis, kind of a hard-nosed thug type of character, and he played with the wonderful actor Dennis Patrick, who would do the show Dallas in the 70s. Dennis Patrick played Jason McGuire, a ruthless charlatan that came to Collinwood to rob Joan Bennett's character, which is Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, of her fortune. Dennis would later come back to Dark Shadows. He was there for a while when Barnabas was there, but eventually he left the show. He wanted to get out of his contract, and he found a way to do it, and he left the show. But the first Willie Loomis character, fine actor who's still alive as I speak to you, I believe, but he was not going to fit into all the dimensions of Willie Loomis. He just wasn't the right actor for it. So he left. I think there was a strike or something. He objected to something and didn't want to work for a while. And they replaced him with John Carlin. John Carlin, the second Willie Loomis, who would become iconic in the role for the remainder of Dark Shadows through into 1971, through 1970 into 1971. Willie Loomis, he'd also play Carl Collins at one point. He's the man who lifts up the coffin after he has busted open the chains to release Barnabas Collins after almost 200 years. He's the man, and John Carlin was an incredible fun performer. He would go on to win an Emmy playing the sheriff in Cagney and Lacey in the 70s. He would win an Emmy finally. He did a few movies, including one right after Dark Shadows you can find on Tubi. It's a kind of a sexy movie that he did. But he worked in a lot of shows, including some soaps. When he would take a break from Dark Shadows, he would do something like Love is a Many Splendid Thing. He supposedly never had a contract on Dark Shadows, but he would come and go, and they always wanted him back. They always wanted him back. John Carlin, who passed away in 2019, he was beloved, and he is still beloved today. You see, when Dark Shadows went off the air in 1971, it was only a few years before, right away, almost right away, the show started to be seen in other countries. Dan Curtis, the strange thing about Dan Curtis is that he never thought the show would be watched a second time. And so they never did retakes. They were one of the first daytime dramas to use videotape instead of film. And back then, videotape was very expensive. So he didn't want to stop unless they absolutely had to. So Dark Shadows is known for its bloopers. And you can, right here on YouTube, see reels and reels of some pretty funny bloopers that happened, including the camera coming into view, the boom microphone, the shadow of the boom microphone, actors flubbing their lines and looking at the teleprompter. It's all there for you to see. Now, some actors were almost flawless with live to tape, because they would, about 8 o'clock in the morning, according to Catherine Lee Scott, who would play Maggie Evans, and Josette Dupre, iconic characters. She said that around a little after 8 o'clock in the morning, they would have what they call a stumble through. They'd read through the script, and then they would have another run through where they did the camera blocking and stuff. Then they would have a dress rehearsal, and about 3:10 in the afternoon, they would go live to tape. Every day, it was like kind of a theater production. It was like they were doing a Broadway play with 4 acts, 23 minutes total, because they have to allow for commercials. And they would do this, and unless someone fell down the stairs or there was just something major, they would not stop tape. They would go on. So when Jonathan Frid said something like, "And he is innocent until proven innocent," it stayed. It stayed. He didn't correct it. He could have corrected it in real time, but that's what he said. When Roger Collins, played by the wonderful actor Louis Edmonds, points to the mausoleum and says, "My ancestors are buried in there." My ancestors. He quickly realized what he says. He says, "Ancestors, my ancestors are buried in there." When he talks about his car in a car accident going down an embankment, he says 100 miles down. And then he realizes what he says. He says 100 miles. It felt like 100 miles, 100 feet. He was very good at correcting his mistakes in real time. Um, every actor was just phenomenal. I have a picture of Louis Edmonds, but it's not here in my Google photos. It's his book. There's Big Lou, um, written by Craig Hamrick. Um, he sat down with Louis Edmonds in the later years. It's just a wonderful book that you can get on Amazon. The Life and Career of Louis Edmonds talks about his early theater times to getting the role as Roger Collins in Dark Shadows, the sister of Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, played by Joan Bennett. And then it talks about his in-between years after Dark Shadows, when he was struggling a little bit but still got a lot of theater work. And then he got a role on All My Children around 2001, was it? And became iconic on All My Children. Great stories in this book. Louis Edmonds, who was fantastic as Roger Collins. He's a hoot. You'll love seeing him. He also played Joshua Collins, because what happened is they decided to go back in time to the beginnings. How did Barnabas become a vampire? The 1795 shows are the best shows, really. Jonathan Fritz said that's Dark Shadows at its very best, when they put on the costumes and they go back in time to 1795. And they stayed there for months because it was so popular with the fans. The same actors playing their ancestors, And the fans loved it. At first, people said to Dan Curtis, including maybe some of the guys at ABC, said, oh, well, you have to hire different actors if you're going back to 1795. And he said, no, the fans will follow us. I trust them. And they sure did. Huge numbers began to occur. A show that had under 1 million viewers was starting to climb to 12 to 16 to 18 million viewers. It would peak in about 1969 at 37 million viewers at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as the kids, including Whoopi Goldberg, rushed home to see a show that they adored, Dark Shadows. I told you that I told you about John Carlin. I told you about Alexandra Mulkey, who is so wonderful as Victoria Winters. She wasn't really a big fan of the show or the material. She thought Victoria Winters was too naive. She will say today, she's like 77 years old now. She said, I didn't understand anything. She would say that she didn't really have a great time doing Dark Shadows, and she left in 1968. She was irreplaceable. They tried to replace her, but the fans would not accept anybody else in that role. And it's sad she didn't go to the conventions. You see, once the show went into syndication, Jonathan Frid tried after Dark Shadows in 1971 to become a big movie star. He had an agent who promised him the world, but he also knew that he had just played a vampire from 67 to 71, and that he was somewhat typecast, and that was true. They were offering him scary movies and what have you. He had done one Dark Shadows movie, House of Dark Shadows. We'll talk about that. And now he was trying to, kind of change his image a little bit and do some important film work. But ultimately, it wouldn't work out. And he would go back to his main love, which was the stage. And at some point he would do Arsenic and Old Lace with some very talented people like Gene Stapleton, who was Edith Bunker in All in the Family, and Gary Sandy from WKRP in Cincinnati, and Marion Ross, who was Mrs. Cunningham, Mrs. C on Happy Days. But Marion Ross said in an interview, she said, we would be coming out at the end. They would be waiting out there, the fans. They weren't waiting to see us. They were waiting to see Jonathan Frid. They were waiting to see Barnabas Collins. This is long after Dark Shadows had been off the air. So Jonathan was able to get a lot of theater work. And then when they syndicated Dark Shadows, like 5 years later, I guess that would be around 1976, the show took off again, and a lot of new fans discovered it. But the fans who had loved it so much wanted to relive the experience, and it became huge. And that's when the convention started, sometimes on the West Coast, mostly in Tarrytown, New York. Lyndhurst is where they shot House of Dark Shadows, the movie, in 1970. So it would be in Tarrytown, the convention, and fans would come from all over, and it would be like Friday through a Sunday, and some of the actors, not all the actors, would be there, and it was a huge thing. And these conventions happened year after year, and there could still be one more because there's still cast members left, but COVID kind of stopped all that. But now things are starting to happen again. So I talk about wonderful actors that that were in the supporting cast, and one of my favorites is this guy right here, Thayer David. His real name was David Thayer, but I think that name was taken, so he just reversed it and became Thayer David. He started on the beginning episodes of Dark Shadows as Matthew Morgan, the caretaker, and was terrific right away. He replaced another actor who was playing the same role, and he made it his own, and he became the favorite. He became iconic, and he was beloved by Dan Curtis and all of the fans of Dark Shadows. Here he is, Timothy Stokes, which happens in 1968. After Matthew Morgan, he was off the show for a while, but then when they did 1795, which lasted for months, he came back as Ben Stokes. Ben Stokes, who was also the caretaker, working for the 1795 version of the Collins family. And watching him, I have never been bored by him. He hardly ever has to look at the teleprompter. Watching his performance in 2022 is just as exciting as it was in 1967, 68, 69, 70, into 71. He is like, it's like watching, like experiencing a fine wine or a delicious steak. Just, he was that good, and it holds up 2022, 55 years later. 55 years later. One of the fun roles he got to do after Ben Stokes, well, after Ben came Timothy Stokes, but then came Count Petofi. Count Petofi. There's Thayer David as Count Petofi with great support. It was just a wonderful storyline. Some fans, there's a few that don't like it, but I loved Count Petofi. Every time Thayer David was on the screen, he was electrifying to me. And his sidekick was Aristide, who was also a diabolical killer. And just terrific. Here's a picture of Thayer David outside the studios at 53rd and 8th. They actually bought a building and made it just the Dark Shadows production studio. Here's Thayer David signing autographs outside the studio at some point. It was just amazing. And Catherine Lee Scott, who played Maggie Evans and Josette Dupre. I have a picture of her here with the guy who played Joe Haskell. I know I have this picture. Yes, here's Joel Crothers, who played Joe Haskell, and Catherine Lee Scott as Maggie Evans, and she also played Josette Dupre in 1795. She said after Barnabas came along, they would come outside the studio because they didn't have the 53rd studio at first. They'd come outside the studio and there were a few teenagers around, and then there was more and more every day. It got to be like the street was full of kids that were blocking traffic. It was hundreds of children coming with their parents to meet the stars of Dark Shadows, and Joel Crothers, who would later go on to Edge of Night. He was beloved, as was Catherine Lee Scott, and they were great together. They were great together. There were various actresses that came along in the role as children. Certainly, in the role of Sarah. Sarah was a ghost. She was the young sister of Barnabas Collins, and she was a ghost. We don't know that right away, but we quickly find that out, and that was played by Sharon Lenz, who is very much alive today. Very much alive today. In fact, she did a movie recently, Sharon Smith Lenz. Just Sharon Smith when she was on Dark Shadows. She has the white hair here. Here she is in her film, which is Brazen Impact. She's the one with the white hair. I'm trying to find that movie so I can watch it. I'm trying to find that movie. But Sarah was the ghost, and she was on in the 1795, and prior to that she was on. And she would play opposite a young man. He was just like 10 years old when he started Dark Shadows, 10 years old. But he would grow up, and he was 14 when Dark Shadows ended. David Hennessy as David Collins. David Hennessy as David Collins. By the time you see this picture, he had become a teen idol. He was in Tiger Beat and 16 magazine. Oh, the girls would stand out there and wait for him to come out. He was a phenomenon during the Dark Shadows time. He will turn 66 years old, October 2022. I turned 66 in March. He will join the 66 Club next month in October. A wonderful, talented actor who would leave acting and go on to what was always his first love, which is he was interested in owning restaurants, managing restaurants, and then he would go on to own them, like in Panama. He has several restaurants in Panama. But the girls loved him, and they still love him. After Sharon Smith her role was complete, there was another young actress that would come along to play opposite David Hennessy. I have some tape on these photos, and they kind of get stuck together. But that actress was Denise Nickerson. Denise Nickerson. Here you see them outside the studio together. Denise Nickerson would go on to play the Blueberry in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. She was chosen to play the Blueberry. She did a TV movie with actress Lee Grant called The Neon Ceiling, which you can find on YouTube. It's fantastic. Right after she did the Blueberry, she was in the Neon Ceiling. An incredible talent, Denise Nickerson, who unfortunately passed away in 2019. 2019, she passed away. There she is with David, and this is when they are about 1969, right there. Here's David Hennessy coming to work. His mom always dropped him off at the studio, mother and son, the great David Hennessy. One lucky fan got to meet David. Many of them did, but here's a picture of Doreen, her encounter meeting David Hennessy outside the studio. Around 1968, say the fall of 1968, Jonathan Frid was just feeling so overwhelmed because he was in so many of these shows, you know. He was the number one character. And he said, "You got to get me some backup because I can't handle 4 or 5 days every week, you know. I can't handle it." And so they went looking for another actor who could carry some of the load. And they found this wonderful actor, David Selby. David Selby would come on in late 1968 to play Quentin Collins. And he was a fan favorite. He didn't push Barnabas out of the way. They still love Barnabas. But David Selby would become a phenomenon. And it was during his tenure that the show would reach like 37 million viewers. He recently did an episode of Chicago Hope. David Selby, he's like 82 years old now. This is a current photo of David Selby now. David Selby now. This was so wonderful on Dark Shadows. And I wanted to show you that other picture of Denise, but I'm not finding it right now. As I say, the photos kind of get stuck together. And I want to try to capture the reason it is so special. Oh, here's the picture of Denise Nickerson. It's like a publicity shot. She was also on, she did a stint on the Brady Bunch, and there's a picture of her in like 20 during the conventions in the corner there. That's how she looked on Dark Shadows, the big picture. But you see her with Chris Knight from the Brady Bunch, and in the bottom you see how she looked in the later years. She left show business. Sad story about most of her money being taken by her family. And she ended up being a secretary somewhere in a medical office or something like that. You know, she would, though, show up at the Dark Shadows conventions, and she was very, very popular there. Here's a full, not a full cast, but a lot of people you see in that picture. Grayson Hall, Lewis Edmonds, Lara Parker, who played Angelique. Phenomenal. And Humbert Allen Estrado played Nicholas Blair. He's the one with the black mustache up at the top of the staircase. And you see Jonathan, you see Thayer David, you see Catherine Lee Scott, and Nancy Barrett. Nancy Barrett. Here's a beautiful picture of Nancy Barrett, who was in the show from the beginning as Carolyn Stoddard. Carolyn Collins Stoddard. Nancy Barrett. She's in her late 70s now and lives in Phoenix, Arizona. She did some theater. She did a little more soap work, but she played a number of characters on Dark Shadows, and you're going to want to see every one of them. Nancy Barrett, incredible performer, absolutely. Here's Joan Bennett from Dark Shadows time. There she is, the Grand Dame, the star of Dark Shadows. She did a limited amount of episodes, and Jonathan's name was always first when she wasn't on. In the late episodes, it would say also starring Jonathan Frid. But there she is, Joan Bennett. You can find her movies on Tubi, and you'll want to see them. Here's another cast photo from the later years. They reunited. David Selby, wearing the light blue kind of half turtleneck. Lara Parker, Catherine Lee Scott, and John Carlin, Willie Loomis. In the later years, he used to go to all the conventions as well. As I say, the show, it's more than a show. It's like an experience that you want to keep reliving. You want to keep having. The storylines were great. Parallel Time was a storyline. They often borrowed from some very famous storylines like Frankenstein. They had a werewolf story. There was a wonderful actor. I don't have a picture of him. Don Briscoe, who played Chris. and he became a werewolf. You're going to want to see that. He's very, very good. He left the business after Dark Shadows and got into some drugs and stuff, and a sad story, but he rebounded from that. But he never really got back into show business. But as I say, if you watch it, you get hooked. It's addicting. It really, really is. People cannot get enough of Dark Shadows. Now, Dan Curtis wanted to try a Dark Shadows movie. And in 1970, he started filming in Tarrytown, New York at the Lyndhurst Mansion. He began filming House of Dark Shadows, starring Jonathan Frid. And that meant that half of the cast, especially the important players, had to go up to Tarrytown and shoot this movie. David Selby was left to, this is in 1970, he was left to carry Dark Shadows, the TV show, with other actors. But what happened is you're going to lose Barnabas for a while, and that's not going to be good. David did a great job, but the storyline started getting shallow and too wild. By the time they got to the Leviathan storyline, which is the least favorite storyline, the fans started getting disenchanted with the show. And Dan Curtis said he was getting disenchanted right along with him. But he made a mistake by taking half of his cast away, the most important players, away to Tarrytown for a few months to film House of Dark Shadows. But that was a big hit. That was a big hit. And they immediately agreed to a sequel, which would be Night of Dark Shadows. Except what happened now is Jonathan Frid saw the film House of Dark Shadows, and it was not meant to be anything like the show. When you're going to do a movie, there's got to be more blood and guts. You're going to kill the vampire in the movie because you can, so many people died in House of Dark Shadows. But most of our favorites were in the movie, not David Selby. But most of our favorites, including David Hennessy, Joan Bennett, Thayer David, were all in the movie, and it was a big hit, but the show suffered. And the fans started to get tired of Dark Shadows, the TV show. And some of the parents that went to see House of Dark Shadows said, gee, I had no idea Dark Shadows was so violent. I don't want you to watch the TV show anymore. So the ratings started to go down, and they never were able to really recover from it. So the viewers started to go down by the millions, and by March of 1971, Dark Shadows was canceled. But they had already promised that they would do Night of Dark Shadows, the movie, but Jonathan Frid wouldn't do it, which enraged Dan Curtis, the creator, who had written the movie, and the whole movie had to be rewritten to star David Selby, who was going to be in Night of Dark Shadows, but now he was going to be the sole star, the big star. I believe Grayson Hall did Night of Dark Shadows. She did. But, Dan Curtis was not happy about that, but Jonathan Frid just thought that he had been typecast enough and was ready to move on. But he would never really move on, because right away they were asking him to come, I think it was to Spain, because Dark Shadows was playing in Spain. They dubbed it in the Spanish language, and Barnabas Collins was the most huge thing Spain had ever had. They were literally preempting newscasts and things like that. It was just wild. So Jonathan went over there to do a promotional tour. He made the mistake of not coming as Barnabas, and that didn't go over too well. The next time he came over, he had the cane and part of the costume. But they just loved Dark Shadows. And then when the show was syndicated, the mania started all over again, and the conventions happened. Jonathan would do readings at the conventions. He started to form a one-man show, which he would do at colleges. He would do a half Dark Shadows segment, and then he would just do readings. He would do poetry and what have you, dramatic readings, and it was very popular. And he did some plays as well. He would go around to the colleges and travel and do plays, and he always had an audience because people loved Dark Shadows. They never stopped loving it, and they haven't stopped loving it 55 years later. Catherine Lee Scott is now in her late 70s, And she's been in so many things, sometimes big parts, sometimes not so big parts, but she has always worked, and she is an author as well. In fact, I have one of her books that I've read right here, one of our books from Catherine Lee Scott. Now With You, Now Without You. This is the story of her second husband who came down with a terrible disease, how they worked through it, their precious last months together. A powerful book that you will want to get. They traveled and everything, even though he had come down with his sickness, and had some special precious time together before he passed away, the love of her life. Although she has a wonderful man now, Patrick Oster, who's a very famous writer and a former CBS correspondent, wrote for Bloomberg and what have you. Patrick Oster, who I got to meet because last year, or in late October, Catherine Lee Scott came back to Lyndhurst Mansion, and she had a meet and greet, and she talked about Dark Shadows, and my lady and I were there. I got to meet Catherine for the first time, and we bought a book, and she signed it and what have you, and she took a picture. In fact, here is me with Catherine Lee Scott last year at Lyndhurst Mansion. Still very, very beautiful in her late 70s. And that is the wedding gown for Josette Dupre. It's a copy of the wedding gown that Josette Dupre wore when Catherine Lee Scott played her in Dark Shadows. Well, you know, she's coming back on October 30th and 31st this year, but I think it's pretty much sold out. What she's going to do this time is she's going to take you on a little tour of Lyndhurst Mansion. We've already taken the tour, and she's going to tell you and point out the places where they shot various scenes from the movie House of Dark Shadows. Then there'll be a meet and greet, you know, there'll be that too, but it sold out pretty fast. So we're going to get Catherine Lee Scott from Dark Shadows as our tour guide on October 30th at Lyndhurst Mansion in Tarrytown. Dark Shadows, just a wonderful show with wonderful actors, so many actors that I haven't mentioned. Lara Parker, phenomenal as Angelique, Cassandra Collins. You know, at first she didn't want to play the bad evil woman, but Jonathan Fritz said, "You have the plum role." Playing the heavy is playing the bad woman is the plum role. It's so many facets to it, and she does it so wonderfully. And there were so many other great actors that came through Dark Shadows. If you watch it, you'll get addicted to it. Hope you enjoyed this little tribute to Dark Shadows. All I can tell you is that I've never encountered another television show that has this kind of staying power and draws you back to watch over and over again. A lot of fun. My personal email is jackthefairguy@gmail.com. Jack the Fair Fairguy @gmail.com. You can comment right here, and many great videos here at this channel. Please subscribe if you would be so inclined and like the video, and check out our other videos, including our most popular topic, Bob Joyce, the pastor from Benton, Arkansas, who looks a lot like Elvis Presley, and many, many hundreds of thousands think he is. We've had a lot of fun with that. The latest video is the reasons why Bob Joyce may or may not be Elvis. That's up. We have the one mofo rule. You ever notice that when you're going about your daily life, there always seems to be this person that comes out of nowhere to mess you up? We talk about that phenomenon in the one mofo rule. We have the Last Days radio show video. We're living in the last days. We have many great videos you'll want to check out here. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you real soon.